From the nation's capital, the McLaughlin Group, an unrehearsed program presenting inside opinions and forecasts on major issues of the day.
GE is proud to support the McLaughlin Group. GE. From residential to commercial lighting, we bring good things to life.
Here's the moderator, John McLaughlin.
Issue 1, L.A. lawless. The 4 white Los Angeles police officers charged with the videotape beating of Rodney King were found not guilty this week by a jury of 12. 10 whites, 1 Hispanic, 1 Asian, 6 women, 6 men. Within 2 hours after the verdict, angry mobs took to the streets of Los Angeles, rioting, setting fires, looting, rampaging, and killing. Unsuspecting motorists were dragged from their vehicles, beaten senseless, and at least 1 killed. This one, and the blows you will see on this videotape did it.
Of automobiles and trucks that enter this area can expect to, oh, look at that. Terrible. And there's no police presence down here. They will not enter the area. That's right. This is attempted murder. They're picking his pockets now. Okay, I think we just took a round. I think we just took... Do you see that? He's reaching up for help, and somebody kicked him in the head.
Of the 30 or so people killed in the riots thus far, the majority were black. Some 1,300 people have been injured. Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley pointed out that the people rioting and looting care little about the King verdict. Rather, they are using the verdict as a pretext for their wickedness and for their vice. They are, in Bradley's words, hoodlums and gangsters.
These acts are being performed by young men who are, in my judgment, simply the hoodlums of this city, who make up many of our gang members, and they are taking this as a crime of opportunity. They are engaging in these crimes as much out of enjoyment for the experience as anything else.
As for the verdict, one juror explained it in this way.
Had Rodney King gotten out of his vehicle, as he was ordered to do, and complied with the policeman's orders, nothing would have happened to him. The other 2 gentlemen that were with him in the vehicle got out quietly and were searched for weapons and were handcuffed. That's all it was. But Rodney King chose to do otherwise.
At week's end, the rioting had spread to Atlanta, San Francisco, Tampa, Las Vegas, Birmingham, and Seattle. Question: was the jury verdict of acquittal a just verdict? Freddie Bonds.
Let me say one other thing first. For heaven's sakes, why didn't those reporters in the helicopter go down and help that guy who was being killed, an innocent victim on the street? Boy, that may be great reporting, but it is certainly inhumane.
How do you land a helicopter in the middle of a busy street?
You go right down. It's pretty easy. You go down and land. There wasn't a lot of traffic there. They could have saved that life. On the question of whether it's just or not, certainly the verdict is understandable given everything we know. The jury didn't just see the 81 seconds of that tape at just that the brutality and savagery of the beating that Rodney King took. They got 3 months of testimony. It was a botched prosecution. These police officers are surely going to get punished elsewhere. I'm sure they'll lose their jobs, probably a civil rights conviction or a civil rights prosecution, and there's a civil suit against them. But let me say one other thing, and it's this. Whatever the verdict, whatever you think of the verdict, it in no way justifies rioting in which 30 people have been killed. Rodney King's alive. These people are dead. It doesn't justify claims that we have a racist criminal justice system, which we don't. And it certainly doesn't justify claims that I've heard on television, probably hear from Eleanor, that somehow George Bush and Ronald Reagan are responsible for the verdict and the rioting.
I don't think I heard what you feel about this verdict. You very carefully skirted your own views of the verdict. Do you support it?
I think it's understandable, given what the jury heard, which is a lot more than you heard.
Okay, this verdict is an absolute travesty. If Rodney King had been white and those policemen were black, we all know it would have been an absolutely reverse decision. And the decision was a setup. As soon as they moved the venue to Simi County, which is an all-white bastion of conservative sentiment where a lot of LAPD cops have fled from the city, I think that the jury was stacked in favor of the policemen, and the defense did a very skillful job of making that jury feel like they were a thin blue line out there against some sort of a crazed animal in the society, when in fact Rodney King was beaten senseless. He had no drugs in his system. He was in drunken stupor, and anybody who watched that tape cannot come away from it without believing there was excessive violence.
Jack Dumont.
Let me say a couple of things. First of all, there's a difference. I mean, none of us here saw the whole trial, so that point is moot. The fact of the matter is, though...
What's your point? That if we had seen the trial, what?
We thought we would be better informed to be making judgments.
Are you making now an excuse, or are you supporting the jury decision here, Jack?
No, I'm not supporting the jury decision. Absolutely not. I was trying to make a couple of points. If you just get off my case for a minute, McLaughlin. The point is, first point is, there's a difference between carrying out the law, the legal system working, and achieving justice. And in this case, we clearly did not achieve justice. The idea that they've got this guy down on the ground, he's helpless, and that they didn't use excessive force, they couldn't convict him of some charge of using excessive force, is nonsense. The second point I'd like to make is that this polarization of this thing on terms of ideological lines is the most damaging and scarring and potentially threatening result of the whole thing.
Did you notice Tom Bradley carve away from the people who are truly protesting the King verdict, the people who are looting and wilding that we saw depicted on television?
I did.
Now the point, if you follow to its natural conclusion, is that this rioting has nothing to do with any condition that is negative with regard to our treatment of blacks in this country. It has to do with criminal elements who are nihilistic in society.
Oh, look, I'm
you
sure.
Believe that?
No, wait a minute, just a second.
You believe that?
I'm sure.
In other words, is there a larger picture?
Let me tell you what I think about all this. First, there was excessive force used. There was no reason why the police had to beat him over the head. They could have hit him on the shins and in the...
We're not jurymen.
Just a second.
We didn't hear the whole thing. That point's been taken. Let's move beyond that.
Just a minute. Secondly, I think the national media did an absolutely disgraceful job in telling the public what it was that was going on during this trial, so that the public at large was not prepared to understand how the jury could have reached that verdict. A boom all over the country. Everybody reacted with shock and disbelief. There was no preparation.
On the basis of the 81-second videotape.
Third, the guy most to blame for this entire thing is Daryl Gates, and here's why. One, he created this dirty, hairy atmosphere in the LAPD. Then he predicted that there would be riots if the policemen were acquitted. And third, he never prepared the city with a plan to contain the violence. Why wasn't the National Guard out in the first place? Why weren't troops federalized immediately? And the final thing is, obviously, the thugs in the streets are responsible for their own behavior.
You have to separate. There is no excuse for looting and the kind of violence on the streets. That is not justified by anything. You have to separate that from the fact, and you cannot get away from the point that Eleanor made, which is absolutely true. If Rodney King had been a white man, this never would have happened. Never mind the color of the cops. It never would have happened. It happened only to black people.
Right.
That's what happened.
Right. I'll tell you, wait a minute. Let me respond to that, and to you too. I think that's entirely wrong. There's a different situation entirely when police become criminal defendants. It happens all over the country. Even if the victim had been white, even if Rodney King were white and all the policemen were black, the chances are they would not have been convicted. Juries do not convict police of that. It happens all over the country. Maybe they should.
When has there been a case like that? When has there ever been a case? Wait a minute. When has there ever been a case?
The case in Florida with the guy on the exact same case in Miami.
The guy was black.
The defendant was black. He was killed by police, and the police were acquitted. I'm talking about cases where it is almost impossible.
When is there a white guy beaten up by black cops?
I'm sure there have been some.
Well, how about one? Give me one.
Do your research and then talk with certainty. You have no facts,
it is very
Fred.
difficult to convict a police officer, and there's an additional reason. All these people are whining about it, but these police officers became defendants. And then they got to use all the safeguards and hurdles and procedural stuff that the Warren Court and liberals had put in to make it hard to convict defendants.
That doesn't mean justice has been done. And if there is justice in this country, the Justice Department will act with swiftness and bring civil rights convictions.
Yeah,
and I have faith in the system. I think it will happen, and I will applaud that.
Can we say that this violence has been multiracial, in as much as 100 Korean stores have been set upon and looted, and the Korean owners are firing at point-blank range almost against the looters, largely black? And can we say that the Salvadorans are wielding machetes in order to fight off blacks who are attacking the firemen?
But look,
there have been more blacks killed by far than whites, but whites have been killed too.
Okay.
It's multiracial now.
Yeah, and there are also lots of Hispanics doing a lot of looting as well. What's happened here is that the dregs of society, triggered by this event, have come to the surface, and the cops aren't there, thanks to Daryl Gates again.
Daryl Gates, I think we agree, the LAPD has been defective in not having anticipated the level of violence that this acquittal would precipitate. Are we all agreed that television, as Mort said, has done a lousy job as far as covering the trial is concerned? But that aside, is it doing a good job in covering, or is it making the whole thing worse?
When does television cover the details of any trial except the William Kennedy Smith trial? The fact is, if people really want to know when their trial, they could buy the Los Angeles Times. People didn't want to know that much about it because they assumed these guys are going to be convicted.
What about the replaying of the Rodney King tape without the full context of the trial itself?
Exactly so. Exactly so.
Context doesn't justify the guys down there.
We want to know about TV's responsibility here. Has it made things worse or not?
I blame TV for a lot of things, but I'm not going to blame it for that.
Last night, or early on Thursday night it was. On Thursday night, NBC broadcast again the Rodney King tape, and nothing but the Rodney King tape. Thank heavens, CNN at least let the defense attorneys explain frame by frame what it was that the jury saw. I mean, the American people in general had no idea of how this jury could possibly have come to it because they'd never seen the defense.
They still don't, because it is indefensible.
The civil disorder in Los Angeles has been addressed by each of the presidential candidates, notably Republican George Bush and Democrat Bill Clinton.
We are concerned about any question of excessive police violence, and we are equally concerned about excessive public violence.
So I hope that we can still use this terrible incident to bring the people of this country together and to reduce brutality. But I must say I'm genuinely surprised and mystified by the verdict based on just what I saw on the film.
The Reverend Jesse Jackson, who floated his name for the Democratic vice presidential nomination this week, also spoke to the Rodney King issue. He had harsh criticism for outgoing LAPD Chief Daryl Gates and for George Bush.
This is the same police department was famous for chokeholds, choking blacks to death. And then when Daryl Gates was asked about it, his response was, the blacks are strong specimens, strong biological creatures. You have to choke them in order to arrest them. When this Rodney King beating took place and was shown on TV on video, 3 days after it had been seen, Mr. Bush invited police chiefs from around the country to come to the White House. Daryl Gates was in that group. He pointed Gates out as a top cop hero after this had happened.
The other presidential candidates, Jerry Brown, Pat Buchanan, and the putative candidate, H. Ross Perot, also addressed the verdict and the civil disorder. How will the political fortunes of each of these candidates be affected by the Los Angeles riots? I ask you, Jack Tremont.
Well, this is a very difficult problem for Bill Clinton. What happens now is we get a polarization. You get a backlash. You get racial polarization. You get a backlash against the demonstrators, which is largely anti-black. A Democratic candidate, by definition, has to be the candidate of blacks first in this kind of a situation. He has to appear to lean that way to hold the black community. There is no way he can do this without being in a very awkward position and being tarred with the things he doesn't want to be tarred with. Just as happened, for example, in a very similar context to Hubert Humphrey in 1968 when George Wallace was running.
Right. But you know, this is a war within, and it seems to me it is calling for leadership of Lincoln-esque dimensions, and I don't think George Bush is capable of it, since he has exploited the divisions, the racial divisions in this country, for a dozen years to further his political career. And Bill Clinton, you're right, is walking a very thin line. He can do it, but he's going to have to take some risks. He's going to have to take the risk of offending scared white suburban voters as the story
Just the voters he needs, though.
as the story moves to white fear.
In the 1960s, the riots in California helped the conservative Ronald Reagan. Is Pat Buchanan going to be helped by this?
I think Pat's definitely going to be helped in the California primary. Not going to make Pat president, but it is going to help because Pat's response was decisive. George Bush's wasn't. George Bush said, well, this is equally wrong with that. You can't make the things equivalent because they're not. You got Rodney King being beaten and you got 30 people being dead and anarchy on the streets in Los Angeles. What Pat said, well, just a second. Eleanor, come on now. Don't give me that Hitler stuff.
Decisiveness is not the only thing that counts.
That's ridiculous, Eleanor.
Well, to say he was decisive.
I resent that Hitler stuff.
I didn't call you Hitler, Fred. Let's not carry it too far.
I know, but come on, Eleanor.
Give me time. I may get there.
What Pat said was, we need maximum force in Los Angeles. And we do need maximum force to suppress the anarchy.
I want to hear from more time.
Can we have a little sweet reason here for a change? Look, this definitely benefits Bush because when there's racial polarization, it does tend to benefit a conservative candidate. Bush has the opportunity to act, to make a speech to the country, to send in federal troops, to deal with the situation. Thirdly, Clinton also has an opportunity, however, if he can come up and do the Tom Bradley thing and the Bill Bradley thing, condemn violence, condemn thugs, and also acknowledge white fear.
Jack, quickly.
But let me make one point. Unfortunately, we have no one at the top level of American politics today who has the confidence of the black community in the way that, say, Bob Kennedy had in 1968 and that Hubert Humphrey had, Walter Mondale had. We have no one at all who has that, or Ted Kennedy had at one time. We have nobody like that in American politics.
Certainly not Jesse Jackson.
Jesse Jackson, I'm talking about among the candidates. And certainly not George Bush, and certainly not Bill Clinton.
Exit question. Will it be a long, hot summer? Freddie?
Probably not.
Why?
Because I don't think this is going to spread.
Why?
Because it's an isolated case.
Freddie, he's giving me word. What's the reason? Will it be a long, hot summer?
I don't want to say yes because it feels like I'm inviting it, and I hope that the people in this country understand how counterproductive this violence is.
Will it be a long, hot summer, Jack?
I sort of think not.
Will it be a long, hot summer?
Nope, this will inoculate it.
You want to tell me why? This
will inoculate it. This will have a hot spring, and the summer won't have to be hot.
Don't you think that the federal prosecution that is ongoing of these 4 white cops is going to siphon off a lot of this negative energy?
Good point.
Good point. It will not be a long, hot summer. Issue 2, a global shame. Let's talk about the international reaction to the Rodney King verdict and its horrid aftermath. In a word, the world was disgusted with America. The London Times said that the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the police shows, quote, the crude white racism of the American South. Such incidents fuel the anger of those elsewhere in the world grown tired of globe-trotting American politicians lecturing them on democracy and human rights, unquote. And the Daily Mail said the rioting is a, quote, volcanic reminder that racism is as American as apple pie, unquote. Francois Mitterrand, president of France, blamed George Bush, quote, this is above all a racial conflict, and a racial conflict is always wed to poor social programs. George Bush embodies an extremely conservative political ideology, unquote. Question, what does this story do to America's image and America's reality as the protector of democracy in the eyes of our allies? I ask you on a clip.
Well, before everyone else here says it, I will say that the Europeans are having more of their own racial problems, so there's a little bit of scapegoating here on their part. But I do think that as people watch what's going on in this country, that it makes a mockery of the New World Order. It undermines the president's moral authority. And I think this is a much bigger challenge for this country to face up to the racial conflict in this country than the Persian Gulf War was easy compared to this. And the difference between the riots of 20, 30 years ago is that the people in our cities now they're better armed than the Iraqis ever were.
Well, well, first of all, I don't think you ought to draw a lot of inferences from what editorial writers write. I mean, what do editorial writers know? I think that's a mistake in the first place. Georges Mitterrand, Francois Mitterrand. What is interesting?
One of those
Mitterrand. What's interesting there is that George Bush's great claim to fame is he had this marvelous relationship with all these foreign leaders. And the guy sticks his shiv in them. And who are the British to talk about race relations to?
Right.
But as a matter of fact, I don't think this does any horrible things to us. This is a racist country. We do have racial tensions and have had for quite a few years.
The Nottingham riots, the Manchester riots, the skinheads. And remember when they went over to Belgium and the soccer riots? 60 people were killed in those riots.
A few Turks show up in Germany, and everybody shaves the hair off their heads, right? And start walking around with Nazi symbols. No, look. There is racism in American society. This society, however, has integrated more minorities into a whole country than any other society in the history of the world. We are talking about a thin minority of thugs that Tom Bradley talked about, who are doing the rioting. This is not the entire black population. In fact, if you take polls of middle-class black people, they want the cops to be tough, too.
Very well stated, and very poignant also, Martin. What do you have to say?
Europeans towering hypocrites, but the fact is, you know what they love more than anything else, because they're so envious of the United States. They love trouble here. They love to write about it. They love to denounce America. It makes them feel good.
Let's face it, the Brits love to hate America.
Exactly.
America is the breakaway colony, and they can't get it out of their craw.
Yeah, but the fact of it is, it isn't just a small minority of thugs. We have isolated a whole group of people in inner city ghettos, and when you look at this through the eyes of television, it doesn't look any better. Let me finish.
Just a second.
I want to finish, boy. Okay, I get to finish my sentence.
Yeah, okay.
Through the eyes of television, it doesn't look any different than the black townships in Soweto.
Oh,
Central South LA doesn't look any different when you look at this through the eyes of television.
Just a second. Are you telling me that a majority of black people are out there rioting? That is a slander on black people. That's what you're implying.
I didn't say that.
That they ought to be out there.
I'm saying that there is enormous frustration in those cities, and we ought to pay attention to people that we have neglected through a dozen years of Republican policies that have ignored the domestic agenda. America looks like South Africa through the eyes of television to the rest of the world.
What is the reality?
Issue 3, long-term consequences. What are the long-term consequences of the civil disorder that we see in the United States this very day? I ask you, Fred Barnes.
I think one of the consequences is going to be that we're going to hear more and more calls to recreate the programs of the 60s that are a source of the problem and aren't the solution. It's these welfare policies that have helped break down families in the black community and other minority and poor communities that have helped create this situation. What we really have here, I think, more than anything else, is a spiritual problem more than where the family has broken down, abetted by these welfare policies, where you don't have where the moral values have vanished, and religion is very, very important. The death of religion in the inner cities is a very important development, and religion needs to be revived.
Now wait, are you opposed to another flood of federal guilt money into institutions that you think have already failed? Is that your problem?
They obviously have failed. We know we wouldn't have this situation now if they had worked.
Nobody is calling for a recreation of the 60s programs. Bill Clinton, the leading Democratic candidate who's going to be the nominee, is talking about a new way of addressing these problems. There is a theme of personal responsibility. What these riots have done, if there's anything positive to come out of this, is it will force the presidential candidates to utter the words poor, black, city, urban, words that they have not entered this presidential campaign up to this point, and we will have to confront this, I hope, as a society in a positive way.
What about black leadership? Is there any black leadership around? Jesse Jackson's a black leader. There are other black leaders. The fact of the matter is that government is largely irrelevant in dealing with something like this, except, I mean, you can't do it with programs, you can't do it with large amounts of money. There's one thing that would ease the situation over a period of time, and that is a really booming economy, because the more people are working, the less likely they are to be in the streets rioting. But that is, sort of the fact is that's sort of a wispy hope right now. There is no reason to be optimistic. The aftermath of the riots of the 60s was 8, 10, 12 years of terrible relationships between blacks and whites in this country, I think it's going to happen again.
Hey, functioning schools, private property ownership, those are two things that have to be done. Families with fathers,
Right, exactly.
and a justice system that works.
Exactly. I mean, I think that a combination of what Fred is talking about, religion, values, family togetherness, and what Eleanor's talking about, concern from the top. I mean, what you don't get out of George Bush is any sense of caring, like you do with Jack Kemp, for example, about what really happens to black America. So, if Bush were smart, what he would do is steal the Clinton agenda. That is, help out, and also demand personal responsibility.
He's laughing at you.
No, I'm not laughing. I think that's right. Clinton has been very good on this question of personal responsibility. We need to see a lot of personal responsibility.
just personal responsibility.
I realize that.
We also need governmental responsibility in terms of providing opportunities to learn skills and jobs and making those schools work.
That sounds like what everybody said in the 60s and it didn't work.
Yeah. Don't you think the real problem is...
This time, there are guns being used, and maybe the white power structure will be scared into doing what's right.
Predictions, Fred.
George Bush will make a big mistake by inviting Mikhail Gorbachev to the White House, which is known, but the mistake is that will irritate Boris Yeltsin and put a damper on Yeltsin's visit later.
Contrary to Fred Barnes' prediction last week, Pennsylvania Governor Bob Casey will not lead the pro-life, anti-choice movement because it was buried in Pennsylvania this week in the election.
Jack?
Razzie gets nipped at the wire in the Derby by Pine Bluff. Put it down. Bet the farm.
What do you say, Mort?
Judge Wilkie's subpoena of all House banking records is a fishing expedition, but the Republicans will say, aha, this is payback time for the criminalization by Congress of the Iran-Contra dispute.
The Democrats will nominate women in 5 Senate races in the upcoming fall elections. Next week, Gorby's back on a 2-week U.S. swing. Bye-bye.
The McLaughlin